Now, for part two of Module 10, we will look at some other aspects of the ancient heroic tradition, as well as how that tradition has been received in various modern contexts. Now, from a theoretical perspective, there is a well-established tradition of modern scholars sort of looking for patterns in the chaos. As I said, we're compelled to reconstruct these myth stories from a variety of fragments that are found in different types of material. But the fragmentary nature of these stories doesn't prevent people from trying to make sense of them. So it's a kind of natural impulse to want to find a sort of system and coherence among the great diversity of mythological storytelling. Now, this has led some scholars to discern particular types of patterns in stories told about heroes. Most famous is the one that's known as the hero's journey, or also known as the monomyth. And according to the promoters of this sort of theory, you can find this type of story in practically every mythological tradition from any time period and from around the world, and that it provides a sort of basic template for how the story of heroes is told, and represents essentially a universal narrative pattern. Now, this is connected by some people to the sort of Jungian understanding of mythology and the whole idea of the archetypes. Other people might say it just simply represents a kind of natural sequence of a heroic type of story. But the hero's journey is represented here in the graphic on the right. And this gets applied to everything from Homeric tradition to Star Wars to all manner of modern manifestations of myth. You have the protagonist, the hero, who then receive some sort of call. They are a task is put before them, a goal or quest is laid at their feet. So that requires going on a journey, and that journey involves movement from the familiar to the unfamiliar, or from the known to the unknown. Often they have assistance from either supernatural or superhuman or super technological sources that aid them in this quest. They often have a kind of guide or mentor as they pass into the unknown, or they face a variety of challenges, temptations, suffering, etc. Then there's a sort of critical moment in the journey where the hero either experiences death or something like death, some kind of cataclysmic setback or ordeal. But this usually tells the hero something about themselves, but also transforms them. And this leads us on the way back with the insight and knowledge gained by the hero. They make their return, which has often an aspect of reconciliation, healing, or atonement. So in general, it's a kind of cyclical narrative archetype. Now, other scholars, such as Vladimir Propp, have tried to identify what we might call the grammar of myth and folktale, that there are certain basic structures and storytelling mechanics that appear in many times and places. And Regardless of what one might think of any one of these individual theories, some of which are quite popular, especially the hero's journey, which was very much promoted by Joseph Campbell in the 20th century, and he himself was very much a Jungian reader of mythology. It seems to point to mythological storytelling as a kind of unique narrative function, that this kind of storytelling draws upon established motifs and symbolism and patterning to accomplish its goals, whatever we think those goals are, whether it's reinforcing society's values, whether it's telling people about themselves and helping them understand their place in the world. There seems to be something that sets apart myth stories from other types of stories. But some scholars would say and readers would say there's a kind of internal dynamic to myth making that causes that sort of uniqueness. Once again, we can do a kind of comparison for the heroic tradition, and this is what the textbook does in this chapter. It points to the story of Gilgamesh, and I think one of the important aspects of this comparison is to recognize, even when we're talking about, the Homeric poems or stories about Achilles and Oedipus, there's a long history of epic storytelling and tales about heroes that go thousands of years prior to that. And when we look at some of the earliest literary traditions from the ancient Near East, and particular Sumerian literature, we find very well developed and important epic stories about heroes. Most famous being the story of Gilgamesh, fragments of which are known and preserved from 1800 BCE. Babylonian versions of the story are known from the 7th century BCE. And Gilgamesh is said to have been a king of the city of Uruk in Mesopotamia towards the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. So this is very far in the remote past. But like the Homeric poems, when these stories were written down in Mesopotamia, they were already part of an ancient oral tradition. So I invite you to make sure that you read that story as a point of comparison. You find the translation in the textbook. But that story itself has been the subject of an interesting modern reception. There's a famous, for fans of the show, it's famous episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 5, Episode 2, called Darmok. And here we have Captain Picard leading the Enterprise on a mission to contact a group of aliens known as the Temerians and form a treaty with them. But once they make contact, they find that the Temerians speak in a strange kind of code. The Temerian captain, who's frustrated by this encounter, has himself and Picard transported down to a nearby planet where he challenges Picard to a duel, which Picard refuses. And the two captains are unable to communicate as the crew of the Enterprise furiously tries to figure out how to speak Tarmarian and rescue their captain. Meanwhile, the two protagonists are in the presence of a hostile being on the planet who they must face together. So they have gone from the familiar to the unfamiliar. They face a kind of challenge and must risk death to face this challenge. Eventually, however, Picard figures out how to communicate with the Temerian captain as he realizes that their language is entirely based on mythological references. So there's a sort of sub-theme of miscommunication and intercultural interaction based on varying forms of, you know, narrative structure and communication, and the importance of context in understanding myth stories. So eventually Picard responds and tries to reach out to his Temerian counterpart by telling the story of Gilgamesh, which leads to an important breakthrough in their efforts to communicate. So I'll post a video of the key scene from that episode in case you're interested in seeing a very kind of unique modern reception of a extremely ancient heroic story from Mesopotamian tradition. Now, another hero who I didn't mention in our last lecture is Ajax. In Greek, his name is Aias, but Ajax is essentially an enormous defensive warrior and another hero of the Trojan War. He is not physically wounded in the conflict, and receives no particular divine assistance, but he ends up being the central character of a play, again by Sophocles, that bears his name, the Ajax. Now, after the death of Achilles, because, spoiler alert, Achilles eventually dies, Ajax feels he should have been given Achilles' armor. This was a great gesture of honor among the heroes, is who was awarded their armor after their death. But instead, the armor is awarded to Odysseus and Menelaus by Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, instead of to Ajax, who considered himself the most preeminent warrior after Achilles. This causes Ajax to fly into a rage, and he resolves to kill the leaders of the Trojan expedition because he feels he's been dishonored. Athena, however, intervenes and clouds his perception, and instead he slaughters a herd of cattle. When he realizes what he's done, he feels immense shame and ends up killing himself, leaving his wife Tecmessa as a widow and their son without a father. So it's another example of a heroic story that involves an important mix of accomplishment, but also suffering. Now, this story too has been subjected to a very interesting modern reception and retelling. There is a project based in the United States that organizes dramatic readings of Greek tragedies to soldiers, veterans, and their families. In particular, dramatic readings of Sophocles' Ajax and also Philoctetes, another tragedy along the same sort of thematic lines. And these dramatic readings are used as an opportunity for the audience to engage with and discuss issues such as PTSD and the psychological impact of war. And its effect on family, community, and the individual fighters. And this proves to be a very powerful kind of instrument to stimulate this kind of discussion as the audience sort of sees themselves and their experiences reflected in stories that were told more than 2,000 years ago in ancient Athens, by veterans, by people who were very familiar with the cost of war and the experiences involved. But that's, a very interesting example of an ancient myth narrative being used not simply for an entertainment purpose and being recycled for a modern kind of retelling of mythology, but also as a kind of therapeutic value. And this speaks to what some ancient Greek thinkers already recognized in antiquity about the value of dramatic performances. Famously, when Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, talked about tragedy in particular, he mentioned this idea of catharsis, that why do people go to the theater only to watch the characters or the heroes experience incredible misfortune and suffering and pain. Well, according to Aristotle, this was a way for them to process their own emotions and to contextualize their own experience and work out their own inner life vicariously through seeing, experiencing intense emotions on the stage. So that's the sort of thinking behind the Theater of War project. So I invite you to watch the video carefully. So that brings us to the end of Module 10 and our discussion of the heroes. We will move on next week to the question of the heroines, the female heroic figures. What does the classical tradition have to say about them?